Shame is not an emotion. It is a weapon disguised as morality, sharpened by weak people who need to feel superior for a moment because they have no control over their own lives. The moment someone attempts to shame you, they are not judging your behavior. They are declaring a quiet war over hierarchy, value, and psychological dominance. And most people lose that war without ever realizing they were fighting. Shame only works on those who still seek permission to exist. It feeds on emotional leakage, on visible reactions, on the reflex to explain, defend, or collapse inward. The shamer is not strong. They are strategic parasites who weaponize social perception because they lack real power. Their strength comes from your response. Their authority is borrowed from your ego. Remove either, and they collapse. Understand this clearly. No one shames someone they perceive as above them. Shame flows downward. It is an attempt to lower your perceived value so they can feel taller without growing. This is not about right or wrong. It is about positioning, control. Psychological economics. Who pays the emotional cost and who collects the profit? Most people respond to shame with emotion, anger, embarrassment, justification. That reaction is the exact confirmation the shamer seeks. It tells them they have access to your identity, that they can penetrate your psychological boundaries, that your sense of self is negotiable. In that moment, you hand them leverage. The true danger of shame is not the external judgment. It is the internal fracture it creates. Once shame enters your inner dialogue, you begin policing yourself on behalf of others. You shrink your expression. You dilute your presence. You hesitate. You overcorrect. And slowly, without resistance, you surrender authority over your own identity. This is how power is stolen quietly. The world is not ruled by those who are morally correct. It is ruled by those who control perception and remain unmoved by emotional manipulation. Shame is one of the oldest tools used to control behavior without force. Societies use it. Families use it. Institutions use it. Weak individuals use it when they lack status, skill, or dominance. The mistake is thinking shame must be answered. It does not. Response is optional. Emotional exposure is optional. Engagement is optional. The most dangerous individuals in history were not reactive. They were unreadable. Their silence was not weakness. It was a refusal to participate in psychological games they had already mastered. When someone shames you, they are testing whether you are internally governed or externally controlled. They are probing for cracks, looking for insecurity, searching for proof that your self-worth depends on their approval or fear of their judgment. If they find none, the power dynamic reverses. Silence becomes pressure. Absence becomes dominance. Indifference becomes an unspoken verdict. You do not matter enough to disturb my internal order. This is where the psychological weapon shifts hands. The shamer begins to feel exposed. Their attempt to lower you fails and instead reveals their own desperation for relevance. This is not passive. This is strategic restraint. Machiavellian power is never loud. It never rushes to defend itself. It understands that explaining is a form of submission, and emotional display is a form of confession. The one who controls their internal state controls the interaction. The one who feels nothing cannot be controlled. But this level of control is not accidental. It is built. It requires the destruction of the ego's need to be seen as good, correct, or accepted. As long as you crave validation, shame will always find a way in. As long as you fear social rejection, you are vulnerable to psychological coercion. This is why most people remain controllable their entire lives. They never outgrow the need to be understood. The following sections will dismantle shame layer by layer, not by attacking the shamer, but by removing the internal mechanisms that give them power. You will see how silence fractures their confidence, how emotional neutrality erodes their control, how absence rewrites hierarchy, and how self-mastery turns attempted humiliation into self-inflicted exposure. This is not revenge. Revenge still acknowledges the other person as powerful. This is elimination, not of the person, but of their influence over your inner world. Once that influence dies, the shamer becomes irrelevant. And irrelevance is the most complete form of psychological destruction. The first psychological collapse does not happen inside you. It happens inside them. And it begins the moment you deny emotional access. Shame requires a visible reaction to survive. A flicker of anger, a defensive explanation, a shift in posture, any signal that says, "You reached me." When that signal never arrives, the shamer enters unfamiliar territory, uncertainty. They expected impact. They prepared for resistance or submission. They did not prepare for emptiness. Your restraint is not passive. It is an act of control. By offering no emotional currency, you break the unspoken contract that shame depends on. The interaction becomes asymmetrical. They are exposed, expressive, invested. You are still unreadable, closed. Power always flows toward the one who needs less. At this stage, the shamer begins to question their own position. Did they miscalculate? Are they invisible? Did their weapon fail? This doubt is corrosive. It destabilizes their sense of dominance far more effectively than confrontation ever could. Aggression would confirm relevance. Silence suggests superiority. Human beings are deeply disturbed by emotional voids. When someone refuses to react, the mind fills the gap with self-doubt. The shamer starts replaying the moment internally, searching for meaning. Your absence becomes a mirror in which they see themselves, insecure, unnecessary, exposed. This is the first fracture in their ego. Machiavellian strategy understands that control is exercised not through force, but through emotional economy. You conserve, they spend. You remain composed, they escalate. Every additional word they offer in pursuit of a reaction weakens their position. Every moment you remain unmoved reinforces yours. Importantly, this is not suppression. Suppression leaks. True control is internal neutrality. You do not argue with shame because you do not recognize its authority. You do not correct false narratives because your identity is not negotiated in public arenas. You do not defend your value because value that must be defended has already been compromised. This stage is where most people fail. They break silence too early. They try to win the exchange. They seek closure. In doing so, they hand the shamer exactly what they want, engagement. But the strategist understands patience. By refusing emotional access, you force the shamer to carry the weight of the interaction alone. Their shame attempt rebounds inward. What was meant to diminish you begins to erode them. Control shifts quietly, without spectacle. This is how dominance is established, not through reaction, but through refusal. Every act of shaming is built on a story. A narrative they tell themselves and others about who you are, where you belong, and how much authority they have over your image. When you refuse emotional access, that narrative begins to starve. But it does not fully collapse until you withdraw something far more threatening, your identity, from their frame. Most people unconsciously allow others to define them in moments of tension. They argue labels, they correct accusations, they explain context. In doing so, they accept the premise that the shamer has the right to assign meaning to their actions. This is the real submission. Not emotional reaction, but conceptual obedience. The moment you stop participating in their narrative, their psychological leverage dissolves. Identity is power. Whoever controls the story controls the hierarchy. When you neither confirm nor deny their accusations, when you neither accept nor resist their framing, you create a void where their assumptions cannot anchor. The shamer is left speaking into empty space, their words unclaimed, their definitions unratified. This produces a specific form of psychological destabilization. Humans are deeply attached to coherence. When their internal story fails to land, the mind panics. The shamer begins to over-explain, exaggerate, or repeat themselves. They seek validation not from you, but from the environment. Their need for witnesses increases. Their composure decreases. This is not coincidence. It is ego collapse in slow motion. Machiavellian thought recognizes that the most efficient way to dismantle an opponent is not to attack their strength, but to remove the stage on which that strength performs. By withdrawing your identity from their frame, you deny them an audience. And without an audience, performance becomes desperation. At this stage, the shamer's behavior often escalates. They may become crueler, louder, more explicit. This is not power, it is fear. They sense loss of control and attempt to reassert dominance through intensity. But intensity without authority only exposes weakness. Your calm refusal to engage communicates something far more devastating than insult ever could. Your perception does not define me. This statement, even when unspoken, fractures the shamer's psychological foundation. They are forced to confront an unbearable truth. Their opinion is not law. The death of their narrative is not dramatic, it is quiet. It happens when no one reacts, when no explanation arrives, when the identity they tried to impose finds no host. What remains is a person speaking loudly to confirm their own existence. And in that silence you maintain, hierarchy is rewritten. Silence is often misunderstood as emptiness. In reality, it is pressure without direction, and the human mind cannot tolerate it for long. Once you withdraw identity and emotional access, silence transforms from absence into a force. It becomes an environment the shamer must now survive inside. The moment you do not respond, explain, or counter, the responsibility for meaning shifts entirely onto them. They are left alone with their own words. Without your reaction to stabilize the exchange, their statements begin to echo. Repetition feels louder, tone feels harsher, intent feels exposed. Silence strips away the illusion of justification and leaves only motive. This is where discomfort begins to metastasize. People who rely on shame are dependent on feedback. They need confirmation that they are right, dominant, or morally superior. Silence denies them all three. It creates ambiguity, and ambiguity breeds anxiety. The shamer begins to imagine interpretations that work against them. Were they too aggressive? Did they reveal insecurity? Do others see through them now? Silence invites self-interrogation, and self-interrogation is dangerous for the ego. Machiavellian strategy uses silence not as avoidance, but as containment. You do not retreat. You hold your ground internally while refusing to feed the interaction externally. This is dominance without movement. The stillness itself becomes unsettling. In power dynamics, the one who speaks least often controls the frame. As silence stretches, the shamer faces a dilemma. Escalate and risk looking unstable, or withdraw and admit failure. Either option diminishes them. Escalation exposes obsession. Withdrawal signals defeat. Your silence forces a lose-lose scenario without you ever issuing a challenge. This is the psychological trap. Importantly, silence works because it is anchored in self-possession. If silence is driven by fear, it leaks tension. But silence rooted in internal authority feels heavy, deliberate, unbothered. Others sense the difference. The environment recalibrates. Observers begin to question the shamer's behavior rather than your character. At this stage, shame loses its social function. It no longer disciplines. It embarrasses the one attempting to wield it. The power vector reverses. The shamer becomes the spectacle. You become the standard. Silence does not humiliate loudly. It humiliates structurally. It removes the psychological scaffolding that allowed the shamer to stand tall. And when that scaffolding collapses, nothing needs to be said. Control has already been transferred. Once identity is withdrawn and silence is enforced, the shamer's mind begins to fracture under its own weight. They become trapped in loops of obsession, replaying the encounter, dissecting every word, imagining outcomes, questioning motives. This is no longer a social interaction, it is a private psychological collapse. Humans are uniquely tormented by what they cannot control. The shamer once believed they commanded your behavior, but now the inverse is true. You are absent. You are still. You are unaffected. And in that absence, they become their own jailer. Every thought circles back to the failure of their strategy. Every fantasy of humiliation is mirrored internally. They cannot escape themselves because you have removed the vectors of engagement. This obsession is not visible at first. It manifests in subtle signs, repeated attempts to provoke, verbal escalation, excessive explanations to others, compulsive self-justification. They attempt to rebuild dominance externally because internally they recognize a loss they cannot repair. The more they chase, the more trapped they become. Machiavellian thought teaches that control is never absolute until the opponent's mind becomes the battlefield. By allowing their obsession to unfold unattended, you turn their own cognition into a prison. Every argument, insult, or accusation they once wielded against you now ricochets inward. Your absence becomes a mirror of their incompetence and insecurity. At this stage, they begin to fracture. Fear of irrelevance, fear of exposure, fear of others perceiving them as powerless, all intensify. Yet outwardly, they may feign confidence, perform superiority, or escalate aggression. This performance is a sign of desperation, not strength. Every act to reclaim authority is evidence of internal collapse. Obsession in the shamer is a silent victory for the controlled strategist. You do not need to attack. You need only persist in emotional detachment, maintaining internal order while allowing them to unravel. Their fixation becomes proof of your dominance, their mind the instrument of their own undoing. Control has shifted completely. They can shame no longer. They can provoke no longer. They can only suffer within the architecture you have imposed: silence, absence, and unassailable composure. In this quiet war, they are both the aggressor and the prisoner. As obsession deepens, the shamer begins to confront a reflection they cannot escape: themselves. In the absence of your reaction, every insult, every accusation, every attempt to diminish becomes a mirror showing only their desperation and inadequacy. They see not you, but the weakness they hope to exploit. This is the stage where regret begins to seed, subtle at first, then consuming. Regret is not moral, it is tactical. They regret having revealed their dependence on external validation. They regret having invested energy in controlling someone who refused the currency of engagement. They regret exposing the fissures in their own self-image, cracks that were invisible until they tried to manipulate your perception. Every moment of shame attempted against you now reads as a confession of incompetence. This psychological inversion is precise. They once sought to project superiority, but in failing, they are forced to reckon with the truth of their fragility. The social armor they wore begins to rust. Every imagined witness, every potential ally, every echo of judgment they anticipated now amplifies the hollowness of their dominance. Regret becomes both weight and wound. Machiavellian strategy understands this stage as the art of indirect destruction. You do not confront, you do not accuse. You remain a constant, immovable force, while they collapse under the architecture of their own ambition and miscalculation. The shamer, in trying to exert control, has revealed their need for it. You simply let their mind complete the work. The mirror of regret also reshapes their perception of power. They begin to see that true authority is not loud, not reactive, and not dependent on coercion. Power is internal, self-contained, and invisible to those seeking to enforce it. In their attempts to shame, they touched something they cannot reach: your self-mastery. And the realization is corrosive. At this stage, they are haunted not by punishment but by insight. They understand in quiet moments that their efforts were wasted, that the battlefield they chose was rigged against them from the start. Every plan to destabilize you has instead destabilized them. And yet, you have done nothing. The victory is structural, strategic, psychological, perfect in its inevitability. They are beginning to understand the cost of misjudging someone who controls themselves. And in that understanding, the seeds of permanent inferiority take root. By now, the shamer's ego is no longer a fortress, it is a series of fragile walls exposed to the unrelenting quiet of your control. Their attempts to impose authority against you have revealed a fundamental truth: the ego that thrives on dominance over others is itself fragile. And when tested by someone who refuses to react, it begins to fracture. Ego fracture is subtle. It starts with internal questions: did I misjudge them? Did I overreach? Was I seen as petty? These doubts multiply into narratives of inadequacy. Every prior victory they believed they held is re-examined under the cold light of failure. Their identity, once inflated by attempts to shame, collapses inward, leaving only anxiety and the desperate need for external validation. Machiavellian analysis sees ego not as personality, but as currency. When the shamer expends it foolishly, it loses value. Every word they spoke to belittle you now returns to them like a boomerang, striking not your defenses but their own sense of competence. They begin to overcompensate, exaggerating authority, performing aggression, seeking allies, yet nothing restores the internal order they once assumed. Symbolically, this is the moment their mask cracks. What was meant to dominate becomes exposure. They reveal not strength, but obsession, fear, and the emptiness that drives their need to control others. Your silence, your absence, your refusal to participate in their narrative functions like a lens, magnifying their internal decay. At this stage, the shamer's mind becomes a battlefield of its own making. They oscillate between denial, anger, and anxious over-analysis, each state feeding the next. They are trapped by their own methods, victims of their psychological strategy. The more they strive to regain superiority, the deeper the fractures grow. This is the strategic apex of indirect dominance. You have not struck, not confronted, not justified. You have allowed their own ego to betray them, using the natural mechanics of human psychology as the instrument of their collapse. Control is no longer external, it is embedded invisibly within the architecture of their mind. In ego fracture, shame returns not to you, but to the shamer, transformed into a relentless internal pressure. Their authority evaporates, their projection fails, and their identity becomes a fragile construct, constantly tested by its inability to dominate someone impervious to manipulation. You do not celebrate this collapse. You observe it, quiet, complete, inevitable. They are exposed. Their weakness is visible only to themselves, and in this exposure, your power is absolute. By now, the shamer has begun to confront the ultimate betrayal of their own perception. The illusion of superiority they relied upon has crumbled entirely. What once seemed like power, the ability to humiliate, to dominate, to control your response, now reveals itself as desperation thinly veiled by performance. Every attempt to assert authority has instead mapped the boundaries of their failure. Superiority is not granted by position, words, or social approval. It is recognized internally, through self-mastery and the refusal to be moved by external judgment. The shamer, in seeking to destabilize you, assumed that moral positioning, social cues, or verbal assault could generate influence over your mind. They did not account for the unyielding architecture of your control. Their error is structural. This stage is critical. The shamer begins to oscillate between imagined dominance and acute vulnerability. Their mind attempts to recreate a hierarchy that no longer exists. They replay the interactions in their head, attempting to reconstruct authority, yet each reconstruction exposes more cracks, more need, more obsession. The more they chase the image of power, the clearer it becomes to them that it was always borrowed, and now the lender has withdrawn consent. Machiavellian strategy identifies this as the point where external weakness masks internal decay. The shamer may still posture, speak boldly, and attempt to rally witnesses, but these acts are performative, hollow, reactive. Their authority exists only in imitation, a ghost of influence that depends entirely on the complicity of others, and you have removed that complicit vector. At this stage, they begin to feel a subtle, corrosive humiliation, the recognition that their relevance depended on your reaction. Without it, they are exposed, not to the world, but to themselves. They see clearly the limitations of their methods, the fragility of their confidence, and the futility of their aggression. What they intended to control has become untouchable. Your role is not to destroy externally. It is to manifest invulnerability internally. The shamer's obsession, ego fracture, and self-reflection converge into a single realization. The illusion of superiority was just that, an illusion, a shadow. And shadows cannot survive in the presence of unwavering internal authority. Power has shifted, not through confrontation, not through counterattack, but through the quiet dismantling of perception. And in this shift, the shamer stands naked before their own inadequacy, powerless to alter the truth that has already been written in silence. They sought to dominate. They now only witness their impotence. And your dominance is sealed, absolute, invisible, unassailable. The ultimate stage of destruction is not confrontation, it is absence. Once you have refused emotional access, withdrawn your identity from their narrative, enforced silence, and allowed obsession and ego fracture to take hold, physical or social disappearance becomes the deadliest instrument. Absence is the vacuum in which their remaining psychological control withers. Humans are instinctively drawn to closure, explanation, and resolution. When you remove yourself entirely from the field, the shamer is left in a void they cannot occupy. Their mind begins to populate that void with fears, doubts, and imagined consequences. Every insult they intended becomes a question without an answer, a strategy without a target. Your absence amplifies the internal collapse already underway. Absence is a weapon because it removes the stage on which they perform. Without witnesses, without engagement, their attempts at dominance evaporate into irrelevance. Social dynamics are merciless. Those who cannot assert influence over their intended target reveal their true position. The shamer becomes hollow, not because of your attack, but because of your refusal to participate. Machiavellian insight recognizes that power is relational, but authority is internal. By removing yourself from the interaction entirely, you transform the relationship from one of contest to one of observation. The shamer's continued presence, energy, and aggression now function as a self-inflicted burden. Every thought, every word, every imagined reaction becomes evidence of their own obsession, their own inadequacy, their own dependency. This stage crystallizes a painful truth. Attempted domination over another is futile when the other does not grant you access. Control is not a right to take, it is permission to hold, and when you revoke it, the shamer's strategies collapse by design. The more they attempt to reclaim relevance, the more their impotence is exposed. Absence does not signal weakness, it signals mastery. It signals that the arena in which others compete is irrelevant to your sovereignty. The shamer's humiliation is structural, inevitable, and complete. Their social power dies quietly, leaving only a fractured mind seeking validation in empty spaces. And in this quiet estrangement, the final lesson emerges: influence can be withdrawn entirely, leaving those who depend on it to suffer the consequences of their own inadequacy. You do not need to strike, argue, or punish. You simply exist beyond their reach. And in that existence, their collapse is absolute. The final stage is the most unsettling, because it reveals a truth few dare to confront. The only person capable of shaming, controlling, or destabilizing you is yourself. Every external attempt, every insult, every accusation, every effort to diminish your presence is only effective if you allow it to penetrate the boundaries of your internal authority. The shamer is merely a reflection of the weaknesses they hope exist within you. True mastery begins when you recognize that external judgment carries no weight unless invited. To destroy anyone who attempts to shame you, you do not strike, you do not retaliate, you do not explain. You render the attempt meaningless by constructing an internal realm that is impervious, self-contained, and unshakable. This is the domain of absolute psychological sovereignty. In this domain, shame loses all potency. Absence, silence, and refusal to engage become more than strategies. They are the natural laws of interaction. Those who attempt to dominate or humiliate are forced to confront the futility of their actions. Obsession, regret, ego fracture, and the illusion of superiority collapse not because of confrontation, but because control has been withdrawn entirely. They are left to navigate a battlefield in which they have no influence, where their methods are neutralized, and where their identity is irrelevant. Machiavelli understood that the most formidable power is invisible. It does not announce itself. It does not react. It exists quietly, with precise calculation, and exerts control by rendering threats impotent. By mastering your own mind, you weaponize absence, neutrality, and self-possession. You transform attempted aggression into evidence of the other's fragility, and in doing so, you turn a potential attack into a structural victory. This stage illuminates a harsh truth about human nature. Power over others is an illusion when internal control is absolute. Influence is fleeting, social hierarchies are mutable, but self-mastery is enduring. To those who seek to shame, you become untouchable. To yourself, you become sovereign. And in this sovereignty lies the final lesson. The greatest destruction is not inflicted upon the world, but upon the need for the world to define you. By eliminating dependence on external validation, you render all attempts at humiliation meaningless. You do not merely survive the shamer, you make their efforts invisible, impotent, and irrelevant. The mind that cannot be shaken is the mind that cannot be shamed. And in that unshakable stillness lies the ultimate authority, the quiet, cold, and undeniable dominance of one who governs only themselves.